In this video, I'm going to be comparing the Kick-Ass movies, there's two of those, to the Hellboy movies. There's three of those, Hellboy, Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, and then the remake. I have not seen the remake. I've seen the first two Hellboy movies along with both Kick-Ass films. First of all, when you look at highest Rotten Tomatoes score for each franchise, in the case of Kick-Ass, the first movie has a 77%. In the case of Hellboy, Hellboy 2, The Golden Army has the highest score of 86%. Hellboy wins here. Then when you look at lowest score, Kick-Ass's low score of 33% for the second movie, with Hellboy, the remake, has the lowest score of 17%. Kick-Ass wins here. And then when you look at average, Hellboy is an average of 61. Kick-Ass has an average of 55. So Hellboy's in the lead right now, 2-1. Then when you look at gap between lowest and highest score, with Hellboy you have a pretty substantial gap of 69 between those two scores. With Kick-Ass you have a gap of 44. Kick-Ass wins here, which actually means we are tied heading into the final round. So this is going to be determined based on my personal opinion. Which franchise do I prefer? In the case of Kick-Ass, I like the idea of exploring what would happen if a kid in the real world, not a comic book world, decided that, hey, I like reading all these comic books. Wouldn't it be fun if I actually became a superhero in the real world? What would happen if a kid decided to do that? And you see in the first film how the kid at first doesn't understand how this really works. He thinks that, well, I'd put on a costume, I have these batons, so now I'm going to go out there and beat people up. That's totally how this works. I could just go out there and beat up criminals now. And it's like, nope, that's not how this works at all. At first, he tries to beat these two people up, and then he goes to the hospital. It's like, yeah, that's what realistically would happen if you're not in a comic book world. If you suddenly thought you could go out there and do this kind of thing. No, you need to learn how to do it right. And then, I like how the second movie further explores this idea that actions have consequences. Hey, this is the real world. This is not a comic book world. And so you can't expect that you just suddenly are a superhero and there's going to be no ramifications because of that at all. I think these movies can be very funny. I like the acting here, and the guy who plays the main character, I think, does a good job. He comes off like a realistic teenage boy. I like the way these movies look. There's action that's entertaining. I think story overall here works, of showing this kid becoming more mature as these two movies go on. Especially when you get to the end of the second film, you realize the ways in which he's changed. I will say, when you look at the first Kick-Ass, sometimes it gets a bit too edgelord, I would say. What I'm talking about here is the part where you have this little girl who's being taught by her dad to be an assassin, and you then see this child in a costume just killing people left and right. You go, okay, I mean, that fits in the sense that this is a more adult movie, but at the same time, I'm thinking, this is drifting too far into the territory of being edgy for the sake of being edgy. You're showing this little girl with a weapon just killing multiple people. It's like, okay, this is extreme. Now, when it comes to the sequel, I think that it does feel more mean-spirited than the first Kick-Ass. I think that doesn't work quite as well. I still think it's entertaining. I still actually have seen that movie within the last couple years. When it comes to Hellboy, I think that the first two movies are really good. I think the story of showing Hellboy trying to figure out his place in the world, trying to figure out who his allies are, what he's going to do, is pretty interesting. I like the way both these movies look. There's action that's entertaining. I like the acting Here, I like how actually both Kick-Ass and Hellboy are different kinds of comic book movies. They don't play out the same as a Marvel movie or a DC movie. They're not these generic comic book movies that are just trying to appeal to the broadest possible audience. No, there's certainly more adult movies that are not aiming for kids. When it comes to which franchise I prefer, I would say the difference here is that I've seen both Kick-Ass movies within the last few years. When it comes to Hellboy, I have not seen every movie because I haven't seen the remake. But at the same time, I think the two Hellboy movies I have seen are better overall than the two Kick-Ass movies. So, which one do I prefer? Well, I'm going to honestly say Hellboy because I think that these movies manage to be for adults without drifting into edgelord territory or coming off as overly mean-spirited. So, wrap things up for this video. In the case of Hellboy, I will say, for closing out, I like the world that's explored in these movies. It's pretty interesting, honestly. I like the bad guys here. I think they're quite good. Yeah, they're pretty close to their Rotten Tomatoes scores. Bye, everyone.